Hey, what's up, you guys? My name's Tyler Rugge. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today is going to be a bearded dragon care guide. As some of you may know, I've had bearded dragons for a long time. I've been keeping them for probably close to 6 or 7 years now. So I have a lot of experience with caring for them. I've also experimented with a lot of different methods of care, and I've definitely made a lot of mistakes along the way and learned from them. So I thought that it would be great if today I could make a care guide for you guys to kind of help anyone who might be wanting to get a bearded dragon, and hopefully I can make it so any first time bearded dragon owners can kind of bypass a lot of the mistakes that I've made along the way. So I'm basically just going to go through everything you need to know to take care of a bearded dragon, everything from all the supplies you need, enclosure, diet, lighting, substrate, literally just everything you could possibly need to know, I'm going to tell you. And I'm also going to have all of this information down in the description below. Any items that I talk about, any supplies that you need, I will link down below where you can buy them. And without further ado, let's get straight into the bearded dragon care guide. So actually right behind me we have Malachi, my bearded dragon. So here's Malachi. For the most part, bearded dragons are very laid back. For the most part, they're usually very friendly and handleable, which is why a lot of people like them. And Malachi is no exception to that. He is a very chill dragon. I'm just gonna put Malachi in the enclosure again. I'm just afraid he's gonna poop on me. That's the main concern that I have. So where to get a bearded dragon? I wouldn't recommend going to PetSmart or Petco or really any chain pet store because you don't know where they're getting the reptiles from. And most of the time, PetSmart and Petco are sourcing their reptiles from a large scale, like mass reptile breeder, where a lot of the reptiles aren't really genetically sound. They don't have very good health, and you just don't really know if it has like parasites or diseases or what it's carrying. The reptiles at PetSmart and Petco are way overpriced. So save yourself a few bucks, go somewhere else. So I would recommend, if you have a local reptile expo, go to a local reptile expo. You might not even know that there's one near you, but go on Google, look it up, and try to find a good breeder. You can also search Facebook or reptile groups and try to find a breeder around you. And if you are struggling to find a breeder around you, you can also go online, and there are plenty of bearded dragon breeders online who will ship bearded dragons to you. And if the whole shipping process makes you nervous, and you also can't find a good local breeder, and your only option left is to get it from a pet store, then I would recommend trying to find either a store that sells reptiles and specializes in reptiles, or just in general try to find a locally owned pet store. If you go one of those routes, then chances are you're going to find a good quality bearded dragon that's also fairly priced, and you know it's going to be healthy and it's just going to be better all around. Also, you might be wondering, can I keep bearded dragons together? The answer to that is no. Bearded dragons are completely solitary. They do not benefit at all from being kept in groups. Some people do keep bearded dragons together and don't have any aggression issues, but isn't always the case. There are plenty of horror stories of bearded dragons attacking each other and bearded dragons losing limbs or the ends of their tails. So only get one bearded dragon. If you want more than one, then you're going to have to get more than one enclosure and just keep them separately. Another thing to keep in mind is bearded dragons do live on average around 15 to 20 years. Some bearded dragons I've known to live even longer than 20 years. Obviously, some might live a little bit shorter than that. It really just depends. But it's a long commitment, so if you want to get a beardy, make sure you're willing to commit to about a 20-year commitment. So next, getting into all of the supplies that you'll need to take care of your bearded dragon. The very first thing you're obviously going to need is an enclosure. So for bearded dragons, I personally recommend nothing smaller than a 75-gallon enclosure. Now, if you go online and you look up bearded dragon care, a lot of people online do recommend 40-gallon breeder to be the bare minimum you should keep a bearded dragon in, but that is what it is. It's a bare minimum standard, and in my opinion, bearded dragons shouldn't be kept in something as small as a 40-gallon because a healthy, active, full-grown bearded dragon is going to need a lot more space to explore and to exercise. Bearded dragons are pretty large. You saw how big Malachi is. A 40-gallon breeder tank simply isn't big enough, in my opinion, for a lizard that big. So what I have behind me is Malachi's enclosure, which is a 75-gallon enclosure. It has sliding glass doors in the front. It's 4 feet long. It's a decent sized enclosure. If you're getting a bearded dragon as a baby, then I would recommend probably getting something smaller to start out, like a 40-gallon or a 20-gallon. But as it gets bigger, you are going to want to upgrade it. And by the time it's an adult, you are going to want to have a 75-gallon tank or larger. You might have some trouble finding a 75-gallon tank because they don't sell those at PetSmart, unfortunately, or Petco. If you have a local reptile store, I would look there. And if not, there are a couple enclosures that I would recommend. So my enclosure, which is behind me, is made by Marty Made. Now, I think Marty Made might just be local to me. I live in Michigan. I'm not sure if they ship enclosures or anything like that, but you could probably contact them and find out. I will put their link down below. But another really great enclosure for bearded dragons are Zen habitats. Now, Zen habitats I would almost recommend more because they are actually bigger, and I actually have a Zen habitat that I keep one of my snakes in. The standard Zen habitat is 4 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. It's equivalent to 120 gallons, so it's actually much bigger, and it gives you a lot more space to work with, and I just think that they're also really beautiful and unique looking enclosures. So I will also link Zen down below. I do have an affiliate link with them if you are interested in getting a Zen enclosure. I would highly recommend Zen enclosures for bearded dragons. So next we're going to talk about lighting and heat. So this is the part that is a little bit tricky and gets confusing if you aren't knowledgeable about this and you aren't already a reptile owner and you don't have knowledge on heating and UVB. It can be really confusing doing the research and trying to figure out what bulbs you should get, what's good, where to place them, and all that stuff. So I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible. Number one, you're going to need a basking bulb. So the basking bulb is going to be the bulb in the tank that you put on one side of the tank, either the far left or the far right, and it's going to create a basking spot and also the hot side of the tank. So there's going to be a hot side and a cool side. You want there to be a temperature gradient so that your bearded dragon can go to the hot side and bask under the bulb when it wants to, but it can also retreat to the cool side if it wants to cool down. And bearded dragons are from Australia and they live in kind of a deserty environment, so very high temperatures. They do need a nice strong basking bulb. Along with the basking bulb, they will also need UVB. So your options here are you could use a mercury vapor bulb. A lot of people just use a mercury vapor bulb because mercury vapor bulbs put off heat and they also put off UVA and UVB. So it's like everything all in one for your bearded dragon. And they usually come, I believe, in 100 watts and 150 watts. You'll typically only need 100 watts, but again, this kind of depends on how far away from the basking spot the bulb is going to be, how tall the enclosure is, and also just how hot it is in the room you're keeping your bearded dragon. I have experience using the ZoomEd PowerSun mercury vapor bulbs. Those are what have worked good for me and what I've used. What's more popular for people who keep bearded dragons is to have a separate basking bulb and then a strip UVB. So this kind of comes down to preference as to whether you'd rather have a mercury vapor bulb or have them be separate. But I've found that most people who keep bearded dragons tend to like to have a strip UVB bulb and a separate basking bulb because having a strip UVB bulb provides them with a wider spectrum and covers a larger amount of their enclosure. So in that case, you're going to want to get a basking bulb that's just going to put off heat. You have a couple options here. You could get one that's marketed towards reptiles, which is personally all I've ever done. I've always used the ZoomEd basking bulbs, and again, you're going to want to probably get around 100 watts. And if your room's a little bit colder, then you might need 150 watts. But I would say 100 watts is a good place to start. Another option is some people will just use halogen bulbs. Halogen bulbs are cheaper, and some people say that they're more reliable. I can't really back this up because I've never used halogen bulbs, but if you would like to try it out, from what I've found, a lot of people use the 60 watt halogen par 30 bulbs, which again, these are all going to be linked down below, and you can also read online, and I encourage you to do extra research beyond just this video anyways. If you're using a 100 watt basking bulb, you're going to want to get a mini deep dome light fixture. The mini deep domes go up to 100 watts, I believe. And then if you're using a 150 watt basking bulb, then you're going to need to get a full-sized deep dome light fixture, and those support bulbs up to about 150, 160 watts. And I also want to mention for the basking bulbs, Do not use colored bulbs. Only use regular, like white or yellow light bulbs. I don't really know why people use them. They aren't beneficial at all. Some people think that your reptiles can't see the light because it's like red, and they think that your bearded dragon or whatever can't see red light, and that's not true. That's a myth. Just because the bulb is red doesn't mean your bearded dragon can't see it. They can still see the light, and it's going to disrupt their photo period. And if you need the temperatures to be a little bit higher at night, get a ceramic heat emitter. Ceramic heat emitters produce heat, but they do not produce light. So if you need higher nighttime temperatures because maybe your house gets too cold at night, then you can use a ceramic heat emitter. And another thing that you can get for your basking bulb, which I would recommend, is getting a dimmer. So the dimmer you can plug into the light fixture, and it makes it so you can dim the bulb, so you don't have to have it on full blast. If you're finding that your temperatures are too hot, then you can simply dim the light and it'll make it a little bit cooler. Once you have the basking bulb, you need to look into a UVB bulb. If you're not using the mercury vapor, then you're going to want to use a strip UVB. So it's going to be like a long tube type of bulb that you're going to put next to the basking bulb to kind of cover the rest of the enclosure. There are two different UVB bulbs that I would personally recommend. Again, I go with ZoomEd usually, and ZoomEd makes something called the Reptisun 10.0 T5, and this is what a lot of people recommend for bearded dragons. It's a really high output UVB bulb. Bearded dragons do need a pretty high amount of UVB exposure. And another really good brand is Arcadia. They make a bulb that's called the D3 Dragon T5 bulb, but basically you want to get yourself a 10.0 T5 UVB bulb and you're going to be all set. There's T5 and T8. T5 is stronger, and T8 people don't really usually use unless they're mounting it inside of the enclosure. But if you're just putting the UVB bulb on top of the enclosure on the screen top, then I would get a T5. But UVB is really important because bearded dragons use the UVB in order to process calcium and make their vitamin D3. If they're not getting proper UVB, it can lead to them having metabolic bone disease, which really isn't good. We're going to get into talking about calcium and supplements a little bit later, but just know that having a proper amount of UV exposure for your reptiles is extremely important. And with that being said, you're also going to want to get timers for your lights. Now, obviously you can wake up in the morning, turn the lights on, and then at the end of the day, turn the lights off. But bearded dragons do benefit from having a pretty standard photo period. Like, you don't want it to be different every single day because it might throw them off. A lot of people keep their bearded dragons lights on from 12 to 14 hours, and I just find it's a lot easier to have timers that automatically turn them on and turn them off at the same time every day so that you're never forgetting and it's never different. So I would recommend getting timers for your lights. It just makes everything so much easier. Now, I know all of the UVB talk can be very confusing, and all of the bulbs can be very confusing. If you guys are interested in learning more about UVB and how it actually works and how to choose the right bulbs for any reptile you have and how to know how to place them and everything, I do have a video where I talk all about UVB. I would highly recommend watching it. It's kind of long, but there is a lot of information in it and it's really helpful. And I actually talked to a lighting specialist at ZoomEd. Just if you're confused about UVB, I think that really easily clarifies a lot of things. So I would recommend watching that video, and it'll be linked down below. So basically, under the basking bulb, you're gonna wanna have like a pretty tall rock or some pieces of wood and different things so that your bearded dragon can climb up and get closer to the basking bulb, or a little bit farther away if they would like. But at the closest point to the basking bulb that your bearded dragon can get to, you want the temperature to be around 110 to 120 degrees. Now, I've seen a lot of variation as to how people like to keep their basking temperature. Some people keep it as low as 100 degrees. I've seen some people say they keep it as high as 130 degrees, which in my opinion, I just think that's kind of hot. I keep mine at 110 degrees. I just think that that's a really good temperature that my bearded dragon likes, but it's recommended to be around 110 to 120 degrees overall. So just make sure it's about in that range. You can use a temp gun to measure the temperature, or you can use a probe digital thermometer. I would recommend getting both. They're both very helpful tools. With the temp gun, you can point it anywhere in the enclosure and figure out the temperature. With the digital thermometers, you can place them in different places in the enclosure and just be able to read the temperature at all times. They're both really helpful, and I would just recommend getting them. But again, the basking temperature, you're going to want to be at 110 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And then as for the ambient air temperature in the enclosure, you want just the overall warm side of the enclosure to be in the 90s. I would recommend around 90 to 95 degrees is good. And then over on the cool side of the enclosure, which is going to be the other end away from the basking bulb, you'll want that to be kind of like in the 80s. I would say around 80 degrees is good. And I also want to stress that I highly recommend the probe digital thermometers over a analog thermometer. I just find that the digital ones are a lot more accurate at reading the temperatures. I would also recommend getting one that reads both the temperature and the humidity in the enclosure. You can get ones that are separate for temperature and humidity, but they also make ones that are just 2-in-1, because you do actually want to keep track of the humidity in the enclosure as well. So as for the humidity in the enclosure, you're going to want it to be around 30 to 40%. It's also okay if it fluctuates and gets up in the 50s, but just in general, around 30 to 40% and some fluctuation is okay. But you don't want it to get much lower than 30 degrees, and you also don't want it to get too high. Having your humidity be incorrect can cause respiratory issues, but overall, I find that oftentimes the average humidity in your house is fine for the bearded dragon, so usually there isn't a whole lot you have to do here, but if you do need to raise the humidity in your bearded dragon's enclosure, maybe you live somewhere where it's really dry, then I would recommend just lightly misting the enclosure as needed, or you could try putting a nice sized water dish in the enclosure, and that will naturally raise the humidity. So next, let's talk about substrate. So substrate is a touchy topic when it comes to bearded dragon keeping, because everyone has their own opinion, and this is one of the things that gets really confusing if you're trying to research it, because I feel like everyone has something to say about substrate, and it's usually different conflicting opinions. So you're like, what is correct? And so I'm just simply going to tell you what my opinion is on the matter. And I also have a video all about bearded dragon substrate, which I'm going to link down below. And I would also recommend watching that video if you want a full-on explanation, because trust me, there's a lot that you have to consider when you're thinking about what substrate to use, and I don't want to have to talk about it for 10 minutes in this video. But just to give you the gist of it, there's loose substrate, and then there's substrate that's not loose. A lot of people are against loose substrate and don't like it. I personally think loose substrate is okay if you have a bearded dragon that is 6 months or older. I don't see an issue keeping it on loose substrate as long as you're using something that's safe. Something that is not safe is calcium sand. Do not use calcium sand. Calcium sand can kind of promote your bearded dragon to eat the sand and put them more at risk of impaction. So just don't use calcium sand. If you're going to use a loose substrate, this is what I would recommend. Either get an arid bioactive mixture. Ones that I would recommend include the Arid Earth Mix, I believe it's called, by Arcadia. And then there's also the Terra Sahara that is made by the Biodude. Those are good substrates. I use the Biodude substrate. I love it. Never had any issues. The main reason people don't like loose substrate is because they are afraid it causes impaction within bearded dragons. I think a lot of what has to do with it is husbandry and not having temperatures high enough. If your temperatures are too low, it puts your bearded dragon more at risk of impaction. So then if your temperatures are too low, plus they're eating a little bit of loose substrate by mistake here and there, then obviously there's a better chance of impaction. But if your temperatures are high enough, then chances are you don't have to worry about anything. I would recommend feeding your bearded dragon on a dish so that you're not just feeding them right on top of the dirt, and you shouldn't have anything to worry about. Again, I would recommend only using loose substrate if your bearded dragon is 6 months or older, because baby bearded dragons are more susceptible to impaction. I decided to let Malachi hang out with us again. He might poop on me, but it's just the risk I'm willing to take at this point. If you don't want to get a pre-made mixture, you can also just mix together play sand with organic potting soil. And you can just mix them together pretty much 50-50, and it makes a pretty decent, like, arid type of mixture. If you don't want to use loose substrate, there are other options as well. And like I said before, if you're getting a baby bearded dragon, I would recommend starting off with not using loose substrate anyways. So other really popular options: one, paper towel. Really easy, straight to the point. You can lay paper towel down. If your bearded dragon messes it up, you just have to throw it away and replace it. There's really no risk there. A lot of people like to use tile for bearded dragons. Tile is a good option as well. Tile looks better. And then the other option is non-adhesive shelf liner. If you don't want to use loose substrate, you really don't have to. You could just use tile, non-adhesive shelf liner, paper towel. One of those things works really well. Once again, I would highly recommend watching my video all about substrates, because this was a very shortened version of my substrate spiel for bearded dragons. But I personally use a bioactive mixture, and my bearded dragon lives in a bioactive enclosure and he loves it, and I haven't had any issues with the loose substrate, with him ingesting it or anything like that. I just take the proper precautions to feed him in a bowl so that he's not eating directly on the substrate. Now, it's also important to add enrichment, places for your bearded dragon to hide and to explore. So I would add things like rocks for your bearded dragon to climb on, maybe pieces of wood for them to climb on. If you have a bioactive enclosure, you can add live plants. And you just need to make sure that the plants you're using are safe for their consumption, because your bearded dragon will probably eat some of the plants. But that's a whole nother thing. I do also have a video on keeping your bearded dragon bioactive, but that's a little bit more advanced. I definitely probably wouldn't start off with something like that, but it is an option down the line if you would like to try it. You can also add big cork rounds. I have a big cork round in my enclosure, and my bearded dragon loves to hide inside of it. So you want to have something that your bearded dragon can hide in. Not all bearded dragons like to use hides, but some of them do, and most people would just recommend giving them something that they can hide in if they would like to. Make sure you're adding a lot of stuff for them to kind of be able to explore, climb on, climb inside of, and you can use things like corkwood, grapevine, really anything, as long as it's wood that you've purchased at a pet store and is for reptiles. I would not recommend going outside and finding pieces of wood, but if you do want to do that, then just make sure you're properly sterilizing it, because stuff outside, again, can have bacteria, disease, parasites. You really don't know. So if you find something outside that you want to use, just make sure you're properly sterilizing it before putting it in with your bearded dragon. So next up, we get to talk about bearded dragon diet. So basically, juveniles and adults have a little bit different diet, but bearded dragons are omnivores, eat both insects as well as plant matter. So juvenile bearded dragons are going to need 70% insects to 30% greens. Adult bearded dragons need about 70% greens to 30% insects. This is just because when your bearded dragon's smaller and they're growing, they need a higher protein content, so they need to eat more insects. But once they become full-grown adults, it's going to kind of shift over to being mostly vegetables and then a little bit less insects. So as far as insects go, you want to make sure you're feeding your bearded dragon a variety of gut-loaded insects. So a really good staple, in my opinion, is dubia roaches. I would highly recommend having a colony of dubia roaches at home, as long as it's legal where you live. It's not legal in Florida or Canada, unfortunately, amongst probably other places, but it's legal where I live. Look up videos on how to start a dubia roach colony and why dubia roaches are awesome, and you'll save yourself so much money if you breed your own dubia roaches. You can also use crickets just from the pet store, and also superworms and black soldier fly larvae all make really great feeders. And then you can also feed your bearded dragon things like hornworms and waxworms every once in a while as a treat. I wouldn't recommend feeding those all the time, but just to add variety to their diet, you can feed those every once in a while as well. Waxworms are just very high in fat content, and you do want to watch out for your bearded dragon's weight. With all these insects that you're feeding your bearded dragon, you want to make sure they're gut loaded. So that means you're feeding them fresh veggies. A lot of websites will sell like gut load packets and different things that you can feed your feeder insects that makes them nice and nutritious, because obviously what goes into your feeder insects is then going to go into your bearded dragon. So you want to make sure your feeder insects are healthy and gut loaded and filled with a lot of good stuff to make sure you're feeding your bearded dragon healthy insects. And then moving on to the fresh veggies. Great fresh veggies to feed your bearded dragon and greens in general are things like collard greens, dandelion greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, squash. I would avoid feeding spinach or tomatoes because they're high in oxalates, which are calcium binding and just makes it so your bearded dragon can't properly absorb calcium. And if you're feeding too much of these things, it can cause them to develop MBD. So I would just avoid feeding those. They're just not necessary. And then at all cost, avoid feeding avocado or rhubarb. Those are toxic to bearded dragons. And then also avoid feeding like iceberg lettuce because that's mostly water. It's not going to be very nutritious and it's probably going to give your bearded dragon diarrhea. I would recommend looking up lists of all the veggies you should feed your bearded dragon. And if you ever have a doubt about what you are about to feed your bearded dragon, just Google it. Be like, is this okay? And I'm sure you'll find the answer. And with that being said, you also want to watch out for your bearded dragon's weight. If your bearded dragon starts looking like it's a little bit overweight, I would recommend cutting back on its feeding a little bit because there's a lot of fat bearded dragons on the internet that people just are in love with, but unfortunately, it's not good. Your bearded dragon relies on you to feed them a healthy diet and keep them healthy. And if your bearded dragon's fat, it can lead to health issues and a lowered lifespan. So just make sure your reptiles are healthy and you're feeding them the appropriate amount. I would recommend getting tongs. Tongs are really nice because you can tong feed your bearded dragon. Some bearded dragons like it when you wiggle things in front of their face, like the greens and whatnot. A lot of the times, if your bearded dragon is picky, which a lot of bearded dragons are picky, sometimes they're more apt to eat if you are like wiggling stuff in front of their face. And just in general, tongs are nice to have so you don't have to like directly touch the insects. You can also give your bearded dragon some fruits as a treat. A lot of berries are safe for bearded dragons, like blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries. Peeled apple is okay. A little bit of banana is okay. Again, just look up a safe list, but to my knowledge, for the most part, you want to avoid anything citrus isn't good, but you want to make sure you're feeding fruits in really low quantities because they are high in sugar. And again, too much fruit is probably going to lead to a fat bearded dragon. So next, and this is really important, get supplements. You're going to want to get 3 things in particular. So first off, you're going to want to get calcium, and there's 2 different types of calcium you're going to want to get. There is without D3, and then there's with D3. So this is just calcium powder, and you're going to either sprinkle it on your bearded dragon's salad or sprinkle it on their insects when you feed them to them. They're going to need the calcium in order to produce D3, and if you don't give your bearded dragon calcium, they can get metabolic bone disease, and you don't want to do that to them. I would recommend mostly giving your bearded dragon without D3 because they can actually overdose on vitamin D3, but it's not common and also not very likely unless you're using the calcium with D3 like every single day. Basically, when your bearded dragon eats the calcium and they go under the UVB, they do produce their own D3. So some people say, oh, well, you shouldn't even have to use the D3 because they produce their own. But the fact of the matter is, they aren't going to efficiently produce as much D3 under a UVB bulb as they would in the wild under the sun. We can get pretty close to replicating the sun in their enclosure, but it's not exactly like the sun, so they just aren't going to produce as much D3 as they would in the wild, if that makes sense. So it's just good to add some D3 back into their diet every once in a while. But I would recommend mostly just using the calcium without D3, and then you can use the calcium with D3 maybe just once or twice a week. Yeah, calcium is really important. I would recommend sprinkling it every time you give them their salad, or every time you give them insects, just sprinkle some calcium on it, and you should be good to go. And then the other thing you're going to want to get is a multivitamin. So there's obviously different brands and whatnot. What I have on hand right now is the Repcal Herptivite multivitamin. So the multivitamin you only have to use maybe like once a week or maybe twice a week. As far as cleaning goes, you want to spot clean every time your bearded dragon poops, obviously. And if you don't, it's going to smell really bad and get really messy. So every time your bearded dragon just poops, you want to just clean it up. I just use diluted vinegar to clean my enclosures mostly because it's all natural and you really don't want to use any harsh chemicals. If you're going to use something like bleach, you're just going to want to make sure you're rinsing everything off really thoroughly. And another really important thing if you're getting a bearded dragon is to set money aside for vet bills. It's probably obvious if you have cats and dogs. Reptiles need to see the vet as well. Bearded dragons do have different illnesses and things that they can get that are going to require a vet's attention, and it happens more often than you'd think. Make sure you have a decent chunk of cash set aside, $500 to $1,000 set aside for vet bills just in case is what I would recommend, because seeing an exotic vet isn't cheap. It's usually like over $100 just to get in the door and have them look at your reptile. And then depending what's wrong with it, if you're lucky, you might just need to get some medications and it'll be another couple $100 and then you get to leave. But heaven forbid anything serious happens and you need to do a surgery or something, chances are it'll be close to $1,000, if not more. So make sure you just have money set aside, like a little vet fund, because you don't want to be in the situation where you have to take an animal to the vet but you can't because you don't have the money. And with that being said, I believe I've covered everything. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know down below. And once again, all of this information basically that I said, but in a little bit less detail, will be in the description below, along with all the products that I said you will need. I will try to put all of those things in the description as well with links to where you can buy them. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Good luck to any of you future bearded dragon keepers out there. I wish you the best of luck. They are really awesome reptiles to own. Very rewarding. Yeah, as long as you do it right, I think that they make great pets. You'll definitely love it. If you found this video to be helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you are new here. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram if you would like to keep up with me and my animals. And I will see you guys in my next video.